All right. My name is Stephanie Potter. I am a senior product manager at Tableau. My team does products that help us to alleviate pain points in the product itself and also to make it easier and faster to diagnose and troubleshoot product issues when they actually happen. So the non-sexy features, but when you need them, you really want them. So I have a co-speaker, Alan.
Thanks, Stephanie. I am Alan Dorhofer. I'm a director of product development, focusing in the platform of the products and in the administration and configuration and installation of the Tableau Server product.
If something is going on about Tableau Server and Alan doesn't know about it, we're all in trouble. Today, hopefully we will be answering questions for all of you. Yeah, sorry. Morning still. Obviously the caffeine hasn't quite kicked in. Our goal for the end of this session is that you all walk out of here with a checklist of all of the questions that you need to think about and consider as you are making your plans for your deployment, either initially or upgrading. And we will cover the fact that there are differences in what you need to think about when you are talking about upgrades versus initial deployments. We'll cover that briefly. But we also want you to understand how much you can actually do with Tableau Server within the environment and setup of the server itself, and how much those choices that you make impact all of your users and your system as a whole. We then will finish up with giving you a little glimpse into some of the things that don't get as much publicity because they're server focused and the majority of the folks at the convention are not server administrators. And so we would like to give you a peek into what is new for 2019. The way we're going to set up the talk is that we are going to talk through briefly some little case studies, and then we're going to give you examples as we walk through each of the areas that we need you to think about and ask questions on, and we'll try and relate those back to the case studies when we can. So we will also then have about, hopefully, 15 to 20 minutes for questions and answers at the end, because we know that as a server admin, it's highly likely that you've got some specialized things within your environment, and you may want an answer or a question. Just, hopefully we'll have enough time for that. We're going to start with the first of our case studies.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, so I'm going to kick it off with our first deployment use case. So this is a large financial services customer setting up a deployment of Tableau to serve the needs of the entire organization. Organization consists of many thousands of users. They expect to have, of those many thousands of users, many hundreds of those users concurrent at the same time. And they're shooting to have 5-second or less response times for loading views. And they also have hundreds and hundreds of millions of rows of data backing all their views. So I am going to cover with this use case what the bank had to think of as they were planning their deployment initially, including things like content layout and security. And then the bank also had to think about scalability, performance, and monitoring, and that's a topic that Stephanie's going to cover next. So first we're going to kind of concentrate on the things you may not think about when you're deploying. So first thing that the bank had to consider was how they were going to lay out their content. So you could choose to use the defaults in Tableau Server. It's set up to be very simple to install. But if you don't actually anticipate and kind of consider how your content's going to be laid out, you will end up getting the default experience, which may or may not work for your company. So this bank first thought, so we have a large company, we have a lot of internal divisions within the company. What's the right way to organize that content for the entire org? So Tableau Server has many different ways to organize content, but it's kind of a hierarchical, straightforward organization, and this slide illustrates that. So at the top level are what we call Tableau Server sites, and sites can kind of be imagined as little virtual servers, and we'll talk about what that means for content in a minute. And within a particular site, then you have projects. Projects are analogous to sort of like folders in a desktop operating system. And the idea is that you may name a folder relative to a division, relative to a subject matter, relative to anything you want, just like you would on your own laptop. And then Tableau allows nested folders as well. We didn't used to. That's actually a feature we added many years ago. For a long time, we only allowed top-level folders or projects. But for a while now, we've supported nested folders, nested projects. And then within projects, whether they're nested or top-level, is where your actual content is stored. And content in Tableau means workbooks, of course, or data sources, which I'll talk a lot more about in a minute here. And then kind of along for the ride with those workbooks and data sources, those workbooks, of course, themselves contain worksheets within Tableau or dashboards, which themselves contain filters, views, attributes, calculations, all the things that are carried along with a dashboard or workbook. And then the data sources themselves are also part of a workbook, but they can also be, as we'll talk more about in a minute, published and shared at the top level, so peer to workbooks. And the data sources themselves, of course, contain filters, and that's what consists of content. So this particular bank ended up choosing a mixture of sites, projects, and nested projects, and we'll go into why here in a minute. So next up, the bank had to consider, now that we've laid out our content, and when we're planning for deployment, they considered how to expose that content, whether it's locked down or shared across the organization in terms of authorization or permissions. And so just kind of analogous to having folders in the OS, we also support various fine-grained or coarse-grained permissions at all of the levels I just described. So in Tableau Server, you can set up an individual permission on a particular workbook so that one or a whole set of users can see that workbook, or you can actually set up permissions in the project that workbook is a member of, such that anything published to that project gets those default permissions that are set up on that project. And the same can be done with nested projects as well. And it's quite a flexible system of permissions, and it's easy to kind of get lost as to what's happening with this particular project, and maybe that particular data source or workbook has had a permission set differently from the project itself. So a good rule of thumb to help you out there is that if you've denied access to a particular workbook or data source to a group or everyone but one person, that will always trump the default allowing rule. So denying always trumps allowing, just as a quick rule of thumb. And then there are also ways to set up basically projects in an open nature, which I'll talk about more when I talk a little bit about data governance versus kind of an open sandbox. And then I'll also talk a little bit about certified data sources, which are really important to help people find data sources. But there's a set of users that can actually set permissions, including setting certified data sources, and those are server administrators, site administrators, project leaders, or actually the content owner who published the asset themselves. All those people can set permissions as well as mark a data source as a certified data source. So the bank in this case, our large company, actually ended up using all of the above permissions in a very flexible way. Many of the divisions in the finance company required projects to be locked down because they were sensitive financial nature, and so that was kind of the default. And so you can lock down permissions so that they can't be overridden in a project. And for those of you that have been around for a while, we haven't allowed you to do that to sub-projects, but just FYI, that is being worked on right now. So that's a long-standing feature request to be able to lock down sub-projects, so that's coming soon, hopefully. Next up, the bank had to consider what the organization was going to do in terms of how their users were going to connect to data. Tableau is very flexible in terms of connecting to data. We've always had what we call a hybrid data technology, and that's usually referred to as either directly connecting to a data source or extracting data sources. But over the years, it's grown into much more than that. A very important concept is what I mentioned before, which is shared data sources. Shared data sources are kind of the opening to governed data sources. So your organization, just like this bank, may end up having a lot of users with Tableau Desktop or creator licenses on server that can also author things on the browser. And you may be in an environment where those users are actually directly connecting to MySQL or SQL Server, or maybe even Snowflake in the cloud. But once they publish them and share them with the rest of the org, they may choose to publish them as shared data sources for which they can go in, either the site administrator or the author, and set permissions to that shared data source so that you can govern that data source and only expose it to the appropriate people that should be able to see that data source. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And the other great thing about shared data sources is that the steward of the data source can essentially go in and set it up so that perhaps you have columns in an Oracle database that say things like field 475. Well, users have no idea what that is. But in your shared data source, you can actually annotate and put a comment next to that field and say, this means profit. This is the profit field, right? And make it very simple. And then you could also certify that data source so that there's a little green check next to it in the UI so people know that is the canonical data source you should be using. It also appears first in the search results. Very important concept for data connectivity. Next up, the financial company, the bank, kind of considered two models. And hopefully you caught the keynote and maybe stopped by the Tableau Blueprint kiosk on the floor. I'd encourage you to look into Tableau Blueprint because it's kind of Tableau's initiative to help people understand and practice best practices in terms of data governance and exposing data to your company. Kind of allowing companies to progress more effectively towards a self-service data analytics environment. In the case of the bank, there are a lot of sensitive columns, a lot of sensitive fields, a lot of sensitive data that would not ever be appropriate to open to the entire company. So in this particular use case, some of the data, quite a bit actually, at this company was chosen to be governed. But some data was also chosen to be exposed to the entire company. Non-sensitive data that was perhaps things like holidays for everyone at the company, you name it. Or if you're not at a bank and literally your entire point is to share data within your company, that's what an open sandbox is all about. So Tableau supports both. In this case, the finance company did a combination of both, but most of their data sources ended up being governed. And I mentioned a few of the ways you could do that. The most important being publishing shared data sources and applying permissions to those shared data sources so that they can only be used by the right people. And the other way that the data is governed is by using that certified data source concept I mentioned that we added to the product many years ago, so that not only can the shared data sources be only seen by the right people, but they can actually be easily discovered by the right people too. Because I don't know about your company, but our company and most companies I speak to, there's some topic, perhaps it's sales data, or perhaps it's particular objectives and key measure data that everyone's tracking, that everyone's searching for data on, and there's 100 different data sources that look like the same thing. Well, with a curated certified data source, you know that this particular one is the canonical one to use. That's a very important concept with governance. And I mentioned the comments that you can add to fields as well with shared data sources. You can actually do that with any data source. But there's also a long-standing feature in Tableau called commenting of workbooks. And so between the comments that travel with workbooks and the comments that can be put on fields, as well as the ability to update those shared data sources such that people using them will get a new column, for example, or get a renamed column in their viz, along with a new feature, a very important new feature that came out this year, actually in 2019.3, called Data Catalog. Raise your hand if you've heard of or have tried to use Data Catalog. First have heard of, and then raise your hand if you've actually used it. No one yet. I'd encourage you to, I'm glad you've heard of it. I'd encourage you to trial it. So data catalog is a new, very powerful feature that's important for data governance on this particular topic. The finance company definitely was interested in this, and they ended up being big users of data catalog, because data catalog is a new feature in Tableau that allows you to see where the data came from, all the workbooks that are using the data source, as well as all the workbooks using particular fields of the data source, as well as all usage patterns of the data source. So it's, there's the aspect of data governance having to do with security and locking things down or exposing things. That's what I've been talking about. But another important part of data governance is learning about the usage patterns of that data. Which workbooks would be affected if we change this column? Who's accessing this data? What are the most popular data sources? Data catalog gives you a rich, searchable kind of overview and with details of all usage of all data sources within your Tableau Server cluster. I'd encourage you to check it out. It's available as a add-on SKU called the Data Management Add-on, and it came out in the last release in 2019.3. Next, the bank had to consider all the security options. Being a bank, and quite frankly, any company these days, we encourage security to be kind of the first priority of everything. Maybe one day I'll put this slide as the first thing, because security, and when we're developing our products, that is the first priority we have. And so that's the same thing with the bank. And the bank learned that fundamentally Tableau Server has a couple of different user roles for security. One is the Tableau Server administrator, or the site administrator I mentioned before. And those are actual users that can log into Tableau Server. The Tableau Server administrator being able to do anything in Tableau. And then site administrators being able to do pretty much anything for just that particular site, not other sites. So those are two concepts of administrators that can do everything, including changing schedules and looking at extract refresh tasks, deleting people's content. They can access any workbook. They can access any data source. And a lot of people say, well, that's great, but I want an administrator who can't see the data. And that's exactly what this bank was looking for as well. And so last year, we introduced a new way of administrating Tableau Server, and we introduced this management console that we call Tableau Services Manager, or TSM for short. And with that, we introduced a new concept of a security login called the TSM administrator, completely distinct from the Tableau Server administrator. And that user, or anyone in the group set up on the OS that's allowed to do that, has the ability to log into the TSM console, either on the web or using command line options, to do things like look at the status of processes in Tableau Server, stop Tableau Server, restart it, change configuration values. That can all be done remotely via browser, whereas if you've been around for a while, that used to be just a dialog that needed to be opened locally on the Tableau Server machines. That user is not the same as the Tableau Server administrator. Those credentials are not shared. In fact, that TSM user is literally a login from the OS that the machine is running on. So if you're running on Windows, that's literally a Windows user with appropriate permissions to install on that machine. If you're running on Linux, it's a Linux user with the credentials as if you were logging into the operating system, completely separate from content and logging into Tableau Server. And in some cases, that user may be integrated with Active Directory or LDAP, either on Windows or on Linux. In some cases not, just depends on how you have your OS users set up. And it's also similar to kind of a third concept of user, which is the run as user, the user that Tableau Server is running as, which we recommended to the bank that they use the least privileged user possible for that, so that the processes are running not with administrative root access, but with just a new user given access to only the things necessary for Tableau, like the data directory and whatnot. And then the next thing the bank considered was all the other options for security, which they were interested in basically all of them. So Tableau Server supports SSL. It can't be configured to use SSL out of the box because you need to actually add your own company's certificates to do that. But we highly recommend that you don't run Tableau Server in any other way. That's probably the first thing you should do when you install, if it's not just a test box that you're looking at yourself. Before you roll it out to your company, is configure SSL certificates appropriate for your company. You could use test certificates, but more likely you're going to use real ones that your users actually have the trusted certificate in their browser cache and whatnot. And so the bank certainly did that. And then there are the other options that they learned about were, okay, so how do our users log into Tableau Server? We would prefer that they don't have to put in a separate username and password just for Tableau Server. Can we integrate with our authentication systems? And we definitely do support that. We support SAML. We support SAML with whatever identity provider works for your company. It might be Active Directory, it might be LDAP. We have separate integrations just for AD and LDAP. You might do one login. You might have other different SAML identity providers. We can integrate with all of those. And then once you've figured out how you're going to integrate users, you can optionally actually use local authentication. So if you don't have any of that, Tableau Server can actually keep track of all your usernames and passwords as well. But once you've done that, then you might want to think, okay, so do I want to require my users to log in every time? Or do I want to have them be able to automatically log in? And so we have many options for that. Using SAML, they can do an automatic login. We have Kerberos for automatic login. We have client certificates, so if your users actually have the right client certificate, they can automatically be logged in. And then we have an old kind of legacy technology that allows for vises to be seen without needing login called trusted tickets, which had been commonly used for creating internet applications or portals that embed visualizations from Tableau, and you can absolutely still do that. It requires a little bit of scripting from your web app to actually get a ticket and to make sure that is authenticated correctly. We actually encourage people to use Kerberos or another single sign-on technology that came after that. It's a little bit more secure instead of that, but you could still use trusted tickets. And then we also support guest access for Tableau Server users that want to share vises that can be seen by anyone. For example, in Tableau Public, literally all vises are open to the public. Maybe you have a few sandbox type vises like holidays at your company that need to be seen by everyone, in which case literally giving permission for guests, meaning no login required for this particular viz if they have the URL to that viz, is a possibility. So the bank ended up not using any of that stuff. They were pretty locked down. They did use Kerberos, and they definitely used SSL, and they integrated with AD. Importantly, Tableau Server also supports data encryption. That was something that came out also in 2019.3 this year. So if you're familiar with our extract technology, there's an extract engine called Hyper. And in 2019.3, we introduced the ability to encrypt Hyper data files at rest. Highly recommended as well. And the bank chose to do that. And so next up, Stephanie is going to talk about another use case and go into scaling and monitoring, which the bank also covered, but we'll switch it to a different company use case just to illustrate other options. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Alan. So this particular company is a computer hardware company, and they have just a couple main locations. And one of the things that they had to think about was that they do have dozens of sites. So even though they have, a couple of geographic locations, they had numbers of teams at those locations. And so they wanted to segregate some of their content. And so they set up different sites. And they also wanted to do a lot of VM clusters so that they didn't necessarily have to run on their bare metal machines all the time. They, as they were thinking about it, started looking at where their users were and what their users were going to be doing and where their data was stored and what were the connections like between all of those points. And by connections, I'm talking pipes, data pipes. How much latency was there between site A and site B? How much latency was there between their databases and their users and where all of their content was stored? Because all of those things and the answers to those questions then impacted the planning they had to do for their hardware and their purchasing as they were scaling up their server. I highly recommend that you talk to your account representatives, because I know each of you will have different needs. So figure out the answers to these questions, and then you can bounce your ideas off of your account reps, because they have a lot of information about scaling, And we're going to cover some basics, but I guarantee you that they will have access to resources that we can't cover in 1 hour. Tableau Server is all about making data available for analysis and visualization to all of your users who you've given all of those permissions to, right? So we've talked about who you want to allow to see your data and how you allow them to see that through the permissions. But now we're going to think about, okay, once we know how many people are going to be doing this, how do we make sure that they have a good experience on this? Because you, as the server administrator, have the power for a lot of their performance issues. And how well your server environment performs impacts how happy your customers are going to be as consumers of the data that is being provided within your system. So when you think about the server environment all total, you think about processor, CPU power, RAM, you think about hard disk space. Each of those things can impact the overall performance and scalability of your server. In general, Tableau Server scales pretty much linearly. So you think, okay, if I need more usage, I add more things. I add more RAM, or I add more disk space, or I add more CPU power. The same holds true whether you are running in the cloud, on a VM, or on a box. Make sure that you provision everything to the usage patterns that you anticipate happening. And I want you to know that these are not one and done conversations in terms of planning. Because as people start adopting Tableau Server and your users start actually going in and exploring content and then creating content and then sharing content, you may find that you need to scale your capacity either faster or slower than you initially planned. And depending upon how you've deployed your capacity, you may find it easy to scale back if no one's using it, or you want to, conserve licenses and change things around. But if you've got a lot of engagement, which often happens, you need to understand how to scale up by adding some of those resources so that as you get more concurrent users, you're not really impacting their ability to see and understand their data. The other thing that you really need to think about from a hardware and resource planning is extracts and refreshing and backgrounder schedules. One of the things that I said, the computer company that we were talking about had 2 locations geographically. They were in dramatically different time zones, and so that made it easier for that company to schedule extracts and background tasks at different times throughout the 24-hour cycle. And by doing that, they could balance the loads and minimize the impact to the users in each geographic location at any given time. So think about, again, geography impacts how you want to set up your nodes and clusters. So one of the things that is really crucial as you're thinking about who your users are and what they're going to do is to understand that from a system usage perspective, users are not all created equal. When you think about who is going to be doing viewing, who is going to be doing creating, and who is going to be doing exploring. So think about your role-based license folks. Anybody who is just viewing, and I shouldn't really use the word viewing, but anyone who is only consuming, anyone who is receiving data but doesn't, and may explore, just a little bit, but in general, they're not pushing the boundaries, they're not digging into your data. They are likely going to be, say, your executives or your directors or just frontline people who are really all they need to do is get KPIs handed to them. Those folks are pretty low impact on your system. So you can have a large number of concurrent users who are just viewing compared to, say, if you've got explorers and creators who are going in there and they are opening up your vises and they're publishing to places or they're creating schedules or they're doing analysis. Because the more that people are querying And the more that people are scheduling jobs and doing alerting and building out refreshes, all of those things have a different impact on your system versus just someone who's looking and consuming data. So if you have a setup where you've got hundreds of viewers and a few creators and a few explorers, your needs are going to be different from a company that, say, everybody has a creator license. And there are companies out there that do it that way, where everybody is really given the power to create. Not every company needs that. Think about it from a weighting perspective. Understand who your users are and what they're going to be doing and what their business schedule from a time perspective is, so that you can plan how much resourcing you're going to need at each point within a 24-hour period. Because your goal is to provide consistency in experience to your users. If you are also a company that needs high availability, how many of you in here need high availability? Okay, cool. So there's probably about half of you. One of the things that you can think about with high availability is that the server now, oh, and how many of you are on TSM versions? Those of you who had, okay, cool. So the server now has the ability to have multiple services on each node, and there's no longer as much of a requirement for which services go on which nodes. So there's not this concept of a primary node. And as you're planning your HA, that's one of the things that you can take usage of, is which services do you need to duplicate across nodes, which services might only need to live on one node. And so think about where your points of failure might be. Think about if you have lots of usage for backgrounders or that sort of thing, how do you want to spread those resource usages across your nodes? So again, it's all about pre-planning and then going back and checking periodically to make sure that things are working as you intended. The one other thing that I wanted to point out, that it's on the slide, but I forgot to actually talk to it, is latency. It's a thing, it's real, and it impacts performance. So the more you can produce data gravity, your data centers close to your servers, close to your users, the more you reduce your risk of performance degradation because of latency. Latency is a thing. So the other thing you need to know is, how is my pipeline working? Do I have a network connection that is always slow between one geographical region and another? Do I have a network connection that occasionally is not great between this data source and, say, my SMTP server as I'm sending out alerts when the data is refreshed? Understand your deployment environment, because the more you understand your deployment environment, the better you can control the decisions you make to impact your users. So I talked a bit about the fact that we can scale things out now by changing which services live on which nodes. Two of the services I would say that have the biggest potential for impact as you are making your plans and changing your scalability is, where does your Postgres live and where do your backgrounders live? Backgrounders, if they're not planned well, can really impact your server performance. So I highly recommend that you think about how many you need and if you can isolate them from your other services, if possible. I know it's not always possible, but if you can, isolating backgrounders and Postgres will protect some of the other services from the potential impacts that can happen. Because you, as an IT administrator, or as a server administrator in this case, can make all the plans in the world, but you can't control what your users do with your server. They are an unknown. You can provide them with best practices guidelines and hope that they read them, but still, somebody might suddenly have a data source with 5 million rows that they want extract refreshed every 15 minutes, and you may not have planned for that. And that's a sudden, oh my. So just be aware that plan for isolation where you can, because that helps protect against the unknown. One of the ways that you can also help mitigate the unknown, shall we say, is monitoring. As you are looking at monitoring, there are multiple levels whereby you can understand what's happening in your server. And you can understand at the user level, you can understand at the service level, and you can understand at the system level. The good news is there are tools out there to help you with every single one of those levels. And this is a very wordy slide. I freely apologize. But I wanted to give some of those tools a chance to show where they are. So when you think about monitoring, and if you're starting at the the system level, then you want to know how much resource is being consumed. Are there spikes that are happening? Are there places where you've suddenly got dead zones that you were not expecting? It's all about understanding how your server works so that you can either A, be alerted when things change, or B, understand whether you are appropriately resourced over time. And that's where the system monitoring really comes in terms of making sure that you can provide that consistency to your users, is by trying to eliminate the peaks and valleys when possible. And again, I cannot emphasize enough, don't starve your servers. Memory and disk space and CPU, they matter. Your users will not know about it, but they will thank you for it mentally when they can actually access their vises and use them quickly. And you will be happy when your server is not constantly going down and dragging. So the next level you can do is the system monitoring, and that's a lot of logs. There are some free tools out there, that LogShark, that you can download and analyze as needed, and Viz and things like that. We've actually also just shipped some tools that can help you understand what's going on in your system from a performance perspective, and I'll give you a little visual preview of that at the end. Use the tools, figure out what you need to know on a daily basis, and how the cadence on which you want to understand what's going on with your server. Because it may be different depending upon how many people are utilizing your server and how critical time sensitive your data is. The more time sensitive your data is, the more you should invest in monitoring. The less time sensitive data, then your cadence might not need to be as great. From a user monitoring standpoint, the reason that you care about the user monitoring is because you want to understand who's utilizing your server. Are your licenses being used? If not, then maybe you need to find out who else might want to use those licenses so you can be changing them out, things like that. Are there certain workbooks that are getting pinged all the time? If those are getting pinged all the time, are they actually decently functioning workbooks from a perf standpoint? Or are they something that as 10,000 users are hitting that workbook and that workbook is really not performant, you as the manager of the server can ping that workbook owner and say, hey, can you look at your workbook and see if there are ways we can optimize the performance of that workbook? Are you querying, all the time? Are you writing inefficient SQL? There are plenty of workbook optimization educational materials out there, and if you as the administrator identify which of those workbooks need a little optimization, you can save time on your server. You also will find that as people start gaining confidence in their ability to create and grow and explore, they're going to publish lots more workbooks and lots more data sources, and those can get stale. And the challenges and the dangers of staleness are, one, you can have out-of-date data available to your customers that you don't want, and two, those things are taking up space, and you may need space for other things. So monitoring your usage of workbooks and who's working or who's utilizing those workbooks can really help you establish policies for turning over content that's not fresh or turning, sort of end-of-lifing things as needed. It's just a good practice to keep your server kind of content clean. So overall, we've talked about a deployment checklist. I'm going to have Alan run it down for us again.
Thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, so when we're giving you the two use cases for rolling Tableau out at scale to two large companies, these are the topics we covered. So this is what the main takeaway from this talk. These are the categories, the items, the subject matter that you need to think about when you're deploying checklists to have a successful large installation. So first of all, figure out how you want to lay out content, what kind of mixture of the different options we have for that. Second, figure out what types of permissions you want to give this content, knowing that there are a lot of options. Do you want to isolate content? Do you not? Third, think about the different ways your organization is going to connect data to be the most successful. Is it going to be open? Is it going to be governed? Fourth, think about that exact topic, governance versus open sandbox, and kind of self-service analytics for all, or a combination of the above. Then next, think about security. And actually, as I mentioned, maybe think about security first. Look at security, look at all the options. Definitely configure SSL on your server as the first thing you do. And then probably look at data security. I didn't mention row level security with Kerberos is also very important. So if your database supports that, we definitely recommend using that so that the user's credentials can be passed in all the way to the underlying data source, and they can only see the data that they need to be able to see. Another important aspect of governance. And then, as Stephanie talked about, scalability, performance. What's the topology need to look like? Do you scale out? Do you scale up? Do you do both? And then lastly, how do you keep an eye on that server to know when peak traffic times are happening, what background processing is happening, when you potentially need to add machines, add capacity. So all these topics together are what a successful deployment of Tableau Server is all about. You can just install it and use the defaults, but it's better to know what's happening, and that's what this talk is all about. So that's the takeaway, but we're next going to for those of you that are newer, and maybe a little bit of a refresher for those of you that have been around for a while, just as a reminder, this is what Tableau sort of looks like under the hood. So this is the architecture of the software itself, sort of analogous to the processes that are running. At the very top, we have what we call our gateway layer. That is the process that actually handles all requests to Tableau Server. Internally, that is literally Apache Web Server, off the shelf Apache Web Server that's configured via our configuration process, but it's actually using the standard Apache configuration. That's the same for Linux as it is for Windows. And then Apache is fronting all requests to the application tier, or what we call the user tier, which is the set of applications that really power Tableau Server and do what Tableau is known for. So there's the application server, which internally we call Viz Portal, which is responsible for handling logins. It's what you see when you first log in. It's where the projects live. It's when you browse around and search. That's all Viz Portal. And then when you finally click on a Viz to view it, that's Viz Portal handing it off to VizQL Server, another very important user tier application. VizQL Server is responsible entirely for interacting, loading, and even web editing all visualizations. So you can kind of think of VizQL Server as the process that is analogous to Tableau Desktop running on server. It's all about the visualizations. You'll see CPU activity in VizQL Server processes when vizzes are being loaded, when they're being interacted with. That's VizQL Server. And then there's Data Server itself. So I mentioned those shared data sources that can be published to Tableau Server. Data Server is the separate process that handles those shared data sources. You'll see CPU activity in that when there are queries to those shared data sources or when those data sources are being loaded initially. And then there's the Hyperdata Engine process or set of processes. That is our extract engine. You'll see that that's a large consumer of CPU, or it can be, because it's handling all queries for all extract files. That's essentially a built-in database to Tableau Server itself. That is when you extract data and publish it to server, or when you schedule refreshes of that data for particular workbooks or data sources, it's Hyper doing all that work. So you'll see that those set of processes that are called Hyper, using CPU and resources for that. And then we have some performance-related things like Cache Server for caching query responses, which internally, by the way, is Redis in the on-premise server. And then beneath that, we have what we call our repository and file server layer. It's where the metadata of Tableau Server is stored. So the names of workbooks, thumbnails, things like that are stored in this layer. Repository is the code name we use, not the code name. It's the object name we use to name the actual Postgres database, which is what we use internally to store permission information, to store all metadata about workbooks, the names of workbooks, the names of projects, all the relationships between them, as well as auditing data, for example, who logged in at what time, which workbooks did they access. Postgres is a very important part of Tableau Server. And then beneath that, there's some coordination and monitoring and management services related to Tableau Services Manager. There are various processes required to bootstrap the system, to make sure it's running, that continue to run when you stop it via the web console, because obviously TSM, if it's going to continue to tell you that it's up or down or allow you to start it again, some process has to be handling those requests. That's what we call our controller process, for example, or the cluster controller. Various processes like that are related to monitoring and managing Tableau Server. So that's what the architecture looks like. Those processes, if you install Tableau Server all on one machine, which is fully supported, this is what you'll see. If you install it on an 8-node cluster like the finance company, or a 5-node work cluster like the hardware company, these processes will be spread out. And we'll talk a little bit about ways you can kind of optimize how you deploy those processes in a minute with some new features that came out recently. And speaking of new features, Stephanie, you want to talk about kind of what's new for IT audience in 2019?
Yes, we'll run through this quickly so that they have some time to ask questions. So I mentioned in the scalability section that you can put different services on different nodes. And the point of this is to be able to optimize your workloads with dedicated node rule. The point of that is to be able to optimize how you manage those tasks over time. But then this server management add-on that just came out adds some extra functionality on the top of that that allows you to really dedicate node roles. And that helps further fine-grain your ability to tune your server. The resource monitoring tool is fabulous. It is, and I'll actually show you some pictures. The resource monitoring tool is a set of technologies that we recently integrated into the server that really looks at what's going on at your server level, and it provides you a series of dashboards that are already integrated and built into your server so that you, as an administrator, can set up alerts and thresholds and really just look at what's going on at a very quick glance, and you don't have to install any other tools or anything that is not directly built into the server. So it's part of the data management add-on, and it's a huge
server management.
Sorry,
Yep.
I keep. There's two that came out this year, and I misname them all the time. It's part of the server management add-on. So the other things on there are the content migration tool, which is really useful if you are moving content around, because that's been a pain point, shall we say. And so any of you who have done upgrades will understand that sometimes as things change, you need to move content from one place to another. This is designed to help that along. Plus, we've optimized some of our abilities to work with Amazon. So the other quick thing that we want to cover is the content browsing experience. These are some small, subtle changes, but they're things that a lot of admins have asked for. The biggest one of these, in my opinion, is the customizable welcome banner. Because a lot of times, companies want to be able to put messaging on the top of their server homepage. Say they know that there's something important coming up, there's maintenance that's going to happen, that there's an upgrade, there are things that they want their users to go and do or not do, as it were. Now you can actually customize your home banner and put that out right there at the front of what your users see every time. It is, exactly, see, somebody who has.
And that's out with 2019.4, which just came out recently. So.
Yeah, supportability is like, whoa, all over that one. The other thing that they changed was how content browsing works, and they've introduced some new features around favoriting and around recommendations, all of which are designed to make the user experience a more personalized and focused experience, and to help users actually discover content. And so those are features that have been integrated into the server, really to make your lives easier, because then people will hopefully ping you less with questions about, how do I find this? Where is that? What did you do with it? We're going to guide them to it now. So, did you want to cover a little bit more
just really quickly,
upgrading potentially too?
I'll talk quickly about TSM. We added something we call TSM Direct Access in 2019, which if you're familiar with TSM, up until that time, you needed to pass in that TSM login I mentioned to scripts if you're using script from the command line, and a lot of folks felt uncomfortable passing in a password, rightfully so. And so TSM Direct Access was added as another option, which is if you don't actually have to pass the password in if the user executing the command is in a TSM authorized group. And so we're able to avoid needing to log in that way. And so essentially group access, whether it's on Linux or Windows, will allow you to execute those commands without needing to pass in the password. A small thing, but significant to the IT folks that are trying to script various TSM commands that we added to that.
Cool. All right, well, these are some of the sessions that have already happened, but that I highly recommend you go back when the streaming videos come out. Go back and watch these. They are fabulous. They will be very useful. And I'll let y'all take pictures. These slides and this session will also, it is recorded and will be available as well.
Yeah, and if you haven't already, I would encourage you to go down to the Data Village floor. Mm-hmm. There's the Tableau Developer Showcase area, kind of to the left of the data area. And there's a particular kiosk there called Managing Server at Scale, I think it is.
So, yes.
There are engineers, staff there all the time that can actually give you a demo of the resource monitoring tool we just talked about, the content management tool we just talked about, basically any of the things we talked about, they can answer questions about. So if you want to see that in more detail and actually see it in action, go on down to the kiosk and we'll be happy to demo it for you.
And the Blueprint folks are really very helpful. It's a new series of training materials and guidelines and guidance that we've put out this year that it's all about building a data culture, and part of that is being a server owner, and how do you, continue to grow your usage and grow your users and make sure that they're succeeding in their business roles, and which is exactly why you're having these servers rolled out. So we've got about 6.5 minutes. We are happy to answer any questions that anyone asks. Yeah.